Welcome to Whisky.com, where fine spirits meet. My name is Luening, Horst Luening, and I'm the master taster of Whisky.com. And today I will tell you a little bit about smoky whiskey. Is there a difference between peated whiskey and smoky whiskey? This difference is often made, but I'm afraid it's not true. There is no difference between peated and smoky whiskey. Why? Well, all the peat levels in whiskey, from very lightly peated to heavily peated, results from peat. Peat is cut in a peat moss, and there are very thick layers of peat where the Scottish people and the Picts, the forefathers of the Scots, already dug peat for having fuel to burn, to have energy. How does a moss create itself? Well, there are plants, small flowers. They grow on top of a very wet surrounding. How to tell that? And then those flowers and plants die and bring a layer of a millimeter every year. And on top of this old layer lives a new layer in the next year, and millimeter per millimeter the moss is growing, and the peat below the moss becomes more and more compact to the heavy weight of the moss. Well, and then those plants rot and brings, a thick layer of fuel lying around in Scotland. If you want to have a look at these peat cutting, have a look at my video which I took going up or hiking up to Loch Ugedal above the distillery Ardbeg. There's as well a helicopter flight to the Ardbeg distillery as well. Wonderful surroundings in Scotland. A lot of people say, well, you might not be allowed to dig all this peat out of Scotland. This will be harmful for the surroundings, and in a few years all peat will be gone. No, not really. In former times, when everybody cut peat for heating their households, for heating the stills in the distilleries, well, that might have been true. There are areas in Scotland around Campbelltown. There's an old NATO base nearby. All the peat mosses are dug out. They are all gone because in Campbelltown there had been over 30 distilleries in the late 19th century. So all cut peat because it was cheap. There was just labor to do. There was no buying coal from England or from the south. Wherever from, there was no oil, just peat. There were all the trees were already gone for the British fleet, so they had to heat with peat. And from that time, the problem with cutting peat carries on to nowadays. But there are calculations inside Scotland that they say, the mosses are growing very much in Scotland because we dug so few peat. And why so few? Because the technique how you produce smoky whiskey became more and more efficient. And from the old kilns where you heated the barley corn over a peat fire, they switched over to drum maltings, where you only take a very few peat to bring this peat level into the whiskey. So times where you dug too much peat out of Scotland, I think they are over. I have a picture of digging peat with industrial size here, and the officials, they tell the people where you're able or you're allowed to dig peat for the whiskey production. Well, those harvesting machines, they look a little bit like farming equipment. I think they come from farming equipment. What is smoke? Well, smoke is in whiskey is phenols. And how do phenols appear or are created? Well, you burn peat, and not with a very intense fire, not with a high temperature fire, but it's a kind of smoldering, where those peat fumes arise and there is a lot of water still in the peat, so that temperatures won't go up too high. And then those phenols are created because the combustion inside these hydrocarbonates is not complete. And this brings phenols, cyclic structures. They are not fully oxidized. That's all you have to know. And if you would burn the peat completely, then everything would result in carbon dioxide, CO2, and water. That's all. But because temperatures aren't high enough, you result in those phenols and carbon monoxide and all those things. So all the peat coming out of the kilns in former times was heavy influence on the people. It was stinking, it was harmful to your lungs and nose. Better to have those drum maltings today. Are phenols good or bad to your health? I think I'm no physician. I can't tell you. Even when I have a PhD in mechanical engineering, I'm no doctor. So I can't tell you really, but I read about, and please Google yourself, that small amounts of phenols shall be good to your health, and high amounts of phenols will be very harmful to your health. So that's it. Everything in large is bad for you. Drink in moderation, as with your whiskey. So people typically tell you that the amount of phenols in your whiskey is less harmful to you than the amount of alcohol in your whiskey. So it's always a good idea not to have too many whiskeys in an evening, or over a week, or over a year. Why do people produce this smoke in former times? Well, they wanted to preserve meat, for instance, or salmon, fish. They smoked the fresh meat and the fresh fish, and the phenols on the fish and on the meat happened to be so toxic to the fungi, which wanted to reproduce itself in the meat, and the bacteria as well. And those phenols were so harmful to them so that they could keep the meat fresh for a long, long time over the winter, where supplies were always short. But large amount of phenols on the outside, black. So cut off the outer slice of the smoked ham or whatever you like to have, because it might be a little bit harmful to you. What's not good for bacteria might not be good for you. The peat in the whiskey comes from drying the barley over a peat fire. And this peat fire is not that hot that all the peat is converted into carbon dioxide and water, but the smoke is rising through the barley corns, the wet germinating barley corns, where starch is converted into maltoses and malt sugars, which we can use for the fermentation to produce an alcohol with the help of yeast. Kind of a fungus. So it's, in former times it was typical to have the smoke in the whiskey. When they changed over to coal fires or natural gas fires for drying the barley, then the peat vanished from the whiskey. So the old-fashioned way to produce whiskey always included peat levels in the barley corn and peat levels as well in the whiskey. And if you hear about parts per million peat levels, ppm, oh, this whiskey has 50 ppm phenols. Well, then those 50 ppm are measured during the production process. These phenols are brought onto the barley corn, and it's quite difficult to keep them on the corn. We'll come to that later. During the distillation, well, distillation is a concentration process. Only part of the peat goes over into the raw whiskey. A lot of these smoky flavors stay back as pot ale or in the wash. Then they started with experiments at Ardbeg Distillery, and they produced the Supernova whiskey, which contained 100 ppm peat in the production process. When I tasted the Ardbeg Supernova, I have a picture of this bottle here, it wasn't that intense as I suggested for me. Why? Well, your tasting buds are non-linear. So in the beginning, they are able, or in your nose, your receptors, tasting buds is the wrong word on your tongue, no, the nose and the top of your mouth, those receptors are able to distinguish very low levels of peat. Why? Well, Stone Age, when you were able to smell the smoke of a fire, you know you were not alone. It could be life-saving to know that an unfriendly tribe rested around the next valley. But when the smoke level rises and rises and rises, then you need an awful lot more peat level, more than double the amount of peat to have a more than double feeling or a double feeling. So you need a lot more to double your feeling of smoke. And I'm afraid if you're going over the top, having those octomores, I tasted an octomore already, then you have 6 times the peat levels of a typical heavily peated Scotch malt whiskey, and it does not feel like 6 times, only perhaps 2 times. And I'm afraid for me, levels go down. So if you increase the peat level more and more, then my sensation about the peat level goes down. Weird, but it is. So most of the Scottish whiskies are produced without any peat. So all these Glenfiddichs, Glenmorangies, Macallans, you name it, all those whiskies come without peat. Sometimes there's a remembrance of very little peat, but this comes directly from the corn. There are substances in the corn which are also later on in the whiskey, which brings you the idea of peat. So even in a whiskey like the Glengoyne, which advertised that they are the whiskey without any smoke in it, some people are able to taste a very, very little smoke in that whiskey. So all those whiskies you aren't able to find smoke in have a peat level of 0 to 6 ppm. So very little, and there is a level from which on a certain person is able to distinguish smoke, and this varies from person to person. Some aren't able to distinguish peat or to find peat in a whiskey at levels of 15, and some find it at 3 or 4. So there's a wide variety in the taste capabilities of the people. So from 7 to 15 ppm, there are some whiskies out on the market. Highland Park, for example, is one of these, as well as Springbank or Ben Romach, traditional. Those have, Ben Romach told me they have 7 to 8 ppm specified for their barley. Highland Park, some have not. Springbank, most of them have, but not all. So they're different. There are a few with a very little peat level in them, and I'm happy that those whiskies have a very light peat level because it's so interesting. It's another dimension of taste inside a whiskey. The next one, I say from 16 ppm, so above 15, up to 30 or even 35. This is medium peated, for my personal view. And there is the Ardmore whiskey from the Speyside, for example, and they have this medium to high peated whiskey because Ardmore produces a lot for the blended whiskey industry, where you always have to have a little peat smoke in those blends. And they work for the Teachers, I think. They are former allied to Mac Distillery. They need inside the corporation one distillery which produces heavily or medium peated whiskey for all of their blended whiskies. Also Bowmore. I have the 12-year-old Bowmore here. Or from the Speyside, the Tomintoul Peaty Tang. Very friendly, very smooth but peated whiskey. Wonderful dram. Here you see that these medium type whiskies are not typically for the Isle of Islay, but for the mainland. On the Isle of Islay, there are typically very high phenol content whiskies produced, but there are a few exceptions of that. For example, Bunnahabhain. A lot of the whiskies from Bunnahabhain, not all, they started to produce heavily peated whiskey, I think in 95 or 97, something around that time. Before they were all unpeated. So there are some unpeated whiskey from the Isle of Islay, but most of the whiskey from Islay is heavily peated. As we all know, Lagavulin, Lefroy, the triple wood, the quarter cask. Kalila, there's a whiskey behind. I don't know, Kalila also has, it's a distiller's edition, so there's peat in it. There's an unpeated Kalila as well. So, but they started to produce this unpeated Kalila from 2002 on, perhaps around that time. And there's Jura. I have a miniature set, 4 miniatures of Jura. The 10 years old origins or the Durach owns, the 16-year-old, they are unpeated, but the Superstition and the Prophecy, they are medium peated. And there's a highly peated whiskey from the Speyside. It's from the Tomintoul distillery, where the peaty tang comes from. It's the Old Ballantrae. So this one is 50 to 55 ppm from the Speyside, very untypical. Well, Isle of Arran with the Marty Moore whiskey as well, highly peated. So everybody tries to, well, take part in this business of the peated whiskies. And from my personal view, from the better single malt whiskies, above the level of the supermarkets, I think roughly 50% is heavily, severely peated. Well, but as I said, in former times all whiskies were produced with drying the barley and through peat fire. So all the old whiskies should be very smoky. But if you have a 50 or 55 years old whiskey, I had already a few of them, well, they are not that peaty. Why? Well, the phenols aren't fully oxidized, as I said in the beginning, and over the time, the constant contact within the breathing cask with the oxygen coming in, the fresh oxygen coming in, oxidizes those phenols very slightly over time. And this oxidization takes away the smoky character from the whiskey and adds complexity. So over the time, with the age, whiskies tend to be less smoky. And so all those old whiskies show, if at all, only very light peatiness. And the heavily peated, like the Lafroig, 25 years old, or a Lagavulin, 31 years old, well, very rare, very expensive, they reduce, during the long maturation period, their peat level as well. So if you think about buying an older whiskey from the highly peated distilleries on the south coast of Ireland, Lagavulin, Lafroig and Ardbeg, I'm afraid the older they get, the less peated they are. So if you want to have a heavily peated whiskey, take one without an age statement. Take a young one. Ardbeg 10 years old, Lafroig 10 years old, Lagavulin 12 years old, cask strength. Then there is more peat level in it. Or go even younger, like this quarter cask or triple wood. They might be 5 years, 7 years old. They will be much more intense. Well, I'm often asked which one is the heavily peated at all you had. Well, if you look at the figures, it's the Octomore 06.3. I have the video here. But what I've tasted, well, not the Octomore, it was over the top. All those phenols brought a somewhat different peat aroma to me. What I wouldn't say that's peated. Well, Lafroig is very much on the medicinal side. So here we have already again all smoky whiskey comes from peat. So there's no difference between peat fire and bonfire, but there is a difference between medicinal smoke and the other smoke. This is what my personal view on this theme is, that there is no peat smoke and dry smoke or whatever. No, we have a medicinal smoke and we have a typical dry hot smoke, bonfire smoke. So the Lafroig is very much on the medicinal side, and Ardbeg is more on the bonfire side from my personal experience. I'm no smoker. If you are a smoker, you might have different associations with this because you're used to smelling smoke and have different things appearing in your brain, in your memory, if you smell some smoke. So there will be very individual memories coming up smelling on that whiskey. Well, I can't tell you which one is the most heavily peated. I think the Lagavulin, Lafroig and Ardbeg, those are the most heavily for me. Then there is the Kalila, Old Belantran, Bunnahabhain heavily peated, Jura heavily peated, Marchie Moor, and so on. And then there is the big, broad base of medium smoked whiskey, like the Bowmore or the Old the Tumental Petit Tang. That's it. Thank you for watching. Hope that brought a little bit of light into the peatiness of single malt whiskey. And stay tuned. There's more to come, and feel free to share this video with your friends.